Good morning, everyone. Yes, yes, yes. All right. Buy around like 30 seconds to get back to your seats. Uh, Once again, welcome to Inspire. For those of you who do not know who I am, I'm Keeman. I'm on the board of the church. The board is kind of like the bunch of people, like where's Reina? Reina's over there. Where's Mike? Mike's over there. August is somewhere around, I'm sure. But we are the people who work with Hamish and Haiti and Corey and Rob as the pastors to kind of keep the corporate side of church going, things like the financials and the audit, just understanding what's going on, making sure that the church is relatively organized, relatively, always a work in progress. Yeah, I'm delighted to be part of Inspire. I think it was slightly emotional, praying off Jeff and Nick and Preston. But I think for those of you who are new, I think that vibe that maybe you caught about the community here, it's very real, right? We've been here for 7 years. It's very real, and it's a great part of this community and this church. Okay, intros are over. Everyone has gotten their seats. I see some people appear to have procured coffee as well during take 3, so good for you. So we're going to continue the message series on worship, right? A life that sings worship. And some of you know, maybe not all of you, but by vocation and training, I am a lawyer. So I can talk a lot, but I also care a lot about what words mean and what definitions are. So in preparing for this message, I went back and I looked up the word worship. And some of you may know this. Anyone who's an English literature major probably knows this. But worship is actually one of those really unique English-only words. Like the English, I guess, I did not actually borrow it from the French or anyone else, which they borrow 50% of the other English vocabulary. But it comes from 2 words, the modern equivalents of which are worth and ship. And really it just means someone who is worthy. And in fact, if there are any Blackadder fans out there, am I dating myself now? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, Steve, we just dated ourselves. 3/4 of the room had no recognition whatsoever. So Blackadder is a Rowan Atkinson show set in, I don't know, the 1500s, I think, Middle English. But it used to be that you would call people, someone who's usually of noble birth or has an important position, your worship, right? And it didn't have to be a priest or anyone who was a religious figure. It could just be someone who was very rich and powerful. It could be your worship. So the word actually was not necessarily born out of a religious context or used only in a religious context. It was used very widely. Just to mean someone who is worthy. But obviously, since we're going to talk about, or we're supposed to be talking about worship in a context of faith, I then started wondering, okay, well, how was this word translated, right? When we see the word worship in the Bible, what is the original, right? Where does it come from? And then I made an astonishing discovery, and I've been trying to follow Jesus for decades now, and every once in a while you learn something new. Either that or I just had not been paying attention in church for 30-odd years, which is also probably somewhat true. There is no Hebrew word for worship. Yeah. How many of you knew this already, before today? Okay, fine. One person showing me up. There is no Hebrew word for worship. I'm gratified that many of you, for this is probably a new discovery for many of you as well. In Hebrew, they had lots and lots of words and lots of actions and expressions that we translate into English as worship, or that the people who translated the Bible have translated as worship. But they don't actually have a word itself that means the exact same thing as worship, as saying someone is worthy. So I'll give you a couple of examples, just so you have some confidence that I am not making all of this up. You can also Google it yourself. That's how I found out. So they have words in Hebrew, and I'm going to mangle all of this. So if you are a Hebrew scholar, I apologize. I am not. But they have words like shacha, which means to prostrate or lie down, to bow down. They have words like yada, which means like to extend or lift your hands. Hallel, to praise without restraint. And this one I actually kind of knew because from it we get the word hallelujah, right? To praise God. So hallel, to praise, often with the connotation of not being restrained, right? So like not caring and just like praising God, right? And the Old Testament has this story about how David basically like stripped down to his undergarments and danced through the city when he was king, just because he was so full of praise for God. So praise without restraint. There's also shabak, which means to praise loudly, right? And I think one thing I kind of realized when I was going through all this is that in the Old Testament, people were very loud in their praise, right? And coming from a more restrained Chinese culture, it's a bit unusual. But nonetheless, right, in that kind of Hebrew cultural context, a lot of times when they praise it was without restraint. It was loudly, right? It was very declarative. And then there was like barak, which means to kneel or to bless. Tehillah, to speak, and I think that's like more like poetry, like in the Psalms. And then there's the final one is this word abad, which means to work or to serve. And all of these words are sometimes translated as worship in the Bible, but not always. But what I took away from this like revelation for me, honestly, was that worship really can take very, very different forms, right? And Corey talked about this last week, and she, was kind of, talking about her dispreference for country music. But there is country worship and there is non-country worship. There's lots of forms of musical worship, and in the same way, there are lots of forms of worship other than music as well. All of which I think are just rooted in this very core idea of worthiness, right? Of declaring that God is worthy. So, or to put it another way, God is God and we, or I, am not. Some examples that I could think of that kind of illustrate this, or that kind of maybe give you some idea of the breadth of what was considered worship in the Bible. First one, probably Cain and Abel, right? The two brothers who brought their sacrifices, their offerings to God. Another one where an offering was involved, and this one is a bit of a disturbing story, right? But the story of Abraham, right? Hearing God's call to take Isaac, his son, up to the mountaintop and sacrifice him. Don't worry if you're unfamiliar with the story. Isaac lived. God provided a ram instead. But it's an interesting example, right? That some forms of worship in the Bible, right, involve sacrifice. In fact, in that culture and that context, like involved blood sacrifice. Less violent examples of worship would be like the Israelites after they crossed the Red Sea and being rescued from Pharaoh's pursuing army, basically having a big old party on the banks of the Red Sea because they were honestly probably just elated to be alive, right? They thought they were going to get massacred, and they did not. And so they celebrated, they worshiped, they danced. There's a really nice passage in Exodus, if you read it, called Miriam's Song, right, where she sings and she exalts in God delivering them. And then there's worship at the tabernacle itself, which before this is like biblical history, but before they actually crossed over into the Promised Land and like settled down and they built the temple. There was a tent, right, where the Ark of God's presence was. That was called the tabernacle. And there was a lot of prescribed rituals and I guess the modern Christian word for it would be liturgy. Or I guess it's not really modern Christian anymore. It's like old Christian word for it would be liturgy. A lot of liturgy, a lot of process, if you will, a procedure for how to worship God. And then another one which I found interesting was the story where the Israelites again were fighting a battle, and what Moses did was that he stood up on a hill, like overlooking the battlefield, and he held up his hand, right? And in his hand was a staff. And as long as his hand stayed up, the Israelites, the tide of the battle was in the favor of the people of Israel. But when he got tired, and this went on for like all day, when his hand would start drooping, then the battle would swing the other way. So I thought that was a very interesting example of worship as well, actually, right? How when his hand stayed up and was proclaiming the sovereignty of God over the outcome of this big fight, the battle went in their favor. But when it did not, when he got tired, the tide of battle would swing. If you want the short version of the story, effectively what happened then was people realized what was happening and they just helped him to hold up his hand, like he had support, right? Which probably says something about worship in community, but that's not the subject of today's message, so we won't go there. So we focused the last few weeks on talking about worship a lot. I think the main paradigm that we've used is the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is worship in this setting, right? As a collective body, singing, playing music. Very few people here actually dance as they worship, but some of us tap our feet. But all of that, right, is worship. And that's kind of what we've been focused on, right? The creative, musical expression of worship, which is definitely like a great way to put God in his place, right? Like to put God, or to declare God's right relationship with us as Lord and our acceptance of, his sovereignty. And I think music is music is special, right? I don't know how many of you ever thought about this, but I think about it quite a bit sometimes. And there's something about music that's just really unique. Like, I think very few other animals make music, right? It's definitely not the way that we do. I mean, birds do, and we find, bird song very musical. But in the sense of like using instruments and like coming together as a band and making music and then singing along with the music, like that's a very human endeavor. And there's something about it that just kind of like just touches us. And it's a cultural universal. Human culture all across the world all have expressions and forms of music. And there's something about it that is it just touches us, right? It touches us emotionally. The songs and lyrics can be catchy. You can stick in your head all day or all week, right? A particular melody, right, can bring back emotions to you years after you first heard it. There's something about music that is special. And I think there's something about worshiping together musically that is special, right? And that's great. But there is more than one kind of worship, right? And the question that I want us to think about today is, how do we worship, how do we acknowledge God is God in everything else? Like with every moment that we have, literally every second of your time that passes. What does it mean to worship God with that second? With every breath that you take, right? What does it mean to worship God with that? With every joule of energy that you have, right? Every motion, every movement, every word, every thought. And then moving beyond your immediate physical body, what does it mean to worship God like with your shoes, your clothes, your bag, your possession, your belongings, your money, your wealth, your whatever it is, right? How do we declare the worthiness of God through all of that? Because I do think that all of this can become worship. In fact, all of this should be worship, right? We're called to live our whole lives in a way that honors God, that glorifies God, that effectively puts us back in right relationship with God. And I think that is pretty much what it means to be a Christian, if you ask me. I know you didn't ask me, but I'll tell you anyway. I think that's what it means to be a Christian. To live our life in right relationship with God, right? To acknowledge that, we are not the center of the universe. God is. And then through our life, formulate a way of living that really celebrates that, right? And that really flows with that, putting God at the center, not instead of us. I was reading and preparing for this message, and one of the books that I picked up was an old book called The Celebration of Discipline by an old well, he's not that old, I think he's still alive actually, but by a Quaker author called Richard Foster. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit, because discipleship comes from this root word discipline, right? But we don't really like hearing the word discipline as it applies to us, right? And we celebrate discipline, right? We'll celebrate the discipline of great athletes, right? And we'll celebrate the discipline of really impressive people who go accomplish a lot. But discipline sounds kind of painful sometimes, right? Does anyone hear discipline and think like, oh my gosh, that's amazing and fantastic and really fills me with joy? Okay, Jeff, you're special. But here's the thing that I think it's one of these hidden truths about discipline. Discipline is not an immense tsunami that overwhelms obstacles in its way, right? Discipline is not like this supremely powerful force that can conquer anything, that just runs something over and just keeps on moving, right? If any of you are anime fans, discipline is not One Punch Man, right? The hero who, Saitama, right? Just one punch, all his opponents always get wiped out. Discipline is not that. Discipline it's more like how a mountain is worn down. It's how you make a valley, right? Carve a valley through the mountains. It's just like a drop every day. It's slow, it's consistent, but it just goes and goes and goes. Right? It's not the first time, right? It's not like one drop of water, like the mountain gets leveled. It's not the 100th time, it's not the 1,000th time, right? But it's just slow, steady, consistent. It's building a habit, right? That's what really discipline is. And if you actually go study and look at the lives of any, a great musician, a great athlete, a great whoever, they build their success on discipline. But not because they just wake up one day and they're just able to play through a 90-minute basketball game or 60-minute basketball game. How long is 60 minutes? Yeah, 60-minute basketball game, nonstop, right? They do it because they practice, right? Slow, steady, day in, day out. They put in all of that time. They practice. That's how they build their discipline. And that's what actually then does allow for those big obstacles, those hurdles to be overcome. By the way, that was completely a digression. It was just a thought that I had on discipline as I was preparing for this. But I thought it was actually a good reminder for us. And I think it applies in the context of worship as well, in the sense that, worship doesn't have to be big and showy. It doesn't have to be the creative team up here, rocking out on guitar and bass and piano and everything else. And it doesn't have to be, moving to Africa for 10 years as a missionary, as an act of worship. All of that is worship, don't get me wrong, but so is the very small, steady stuff we do day in and day out. That can also be worship. So, so what does living a life of worship mean? What is it living a life that declares God's sovereignty in every breath, in every moment, in everything that we do? What does that actually look like? And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. As I was preparing this, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I talked about this already. And I went back through my notes, and sometime last year, I was asked to talk about living a generous life, right? Or what does it mean to be generous? And my conclusion was that following Jesus means living a generous life. You can't follow Jesus and not be generous. And that is also what I feel to be, again, at the core of worship, right? Because think of it this way. if you are going to declare that God is worthy, if you're going to say, this is not about me, my life is not about me, my moments, my time, my breath, my possessions, whatever it is, it's not about me, but it's about God, then you have to kind of move that focus off of you, right? We can't be the center anymore, but instead, God and the things of God have to be the center. So, and if you're going to do that, then I think that is, in a way, that is an expression of generosity. Because generosity, again, in the same way, generosity is, okay, let me rephrase. Generosity should not be about you, right? Generosity should be about others, should be about someone else, something that is bigger than yourself, something that is other than yourself. I say should because Jesus does have the story of, and he does kind of reprimand, some of the religious leaders of his time who basically made a big show of being generous, right? Like they would give in public, and he said that's not real generosity, right? Like when you give, your left hand should not know what your right hand is doing. So what generosity should be about making other people the focus instead of yourself. And I do think, again, right, that is inextricably linked to worship, moving that focus off of us, putting it on God instead. So following Jesus, worshiping Jesus, it just means living a life, or does require us to live a life, and will naturally lead to us living a life that is generous in every way. We'll be generous with our time, with the things that we have, with our energy, our emotion, our attention. We will move from being less concerned about us and ourselves and more concerned about other people. And this is all backed up by scripture. I'm not just making all of this up. So I'm sure you're wondering, okay, this must be like 1/3 of the way through the message, and where is the scripture? So I like my lovely assistant, Greg, to pull up the first scripture. Thanks, dude. So Romans 12:1, and we'll just focus on the first part of this, taken from the message. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Make it worship, right? You're sleeping, you're eating, you're working, you're walking around. Make it worship. And I think one of the best ways that we can do this is by being generous with the people around us. And in 1 John chapter 4, this was one of the exhortations that John had for the church back then, right? He said, if you claim to love God, yet you hate a brother or a sister, you are a liar. I do appreciate the fact that John kind of just called it as it is. Like, he's not like being nice and beating around the bush. He's like, yeah, you say you love God, but you're not loving someone else, then you're lying, right? You're a liar. Whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen, right? So, and he has given us this command. Anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. So, you can't love God, you can't worship God unless you're also loving other people. You can't be generous toward God unless you're also generous to other people. Now, when people hear the word generosity and giving in church, it often is associated with like giving to the church and tithing to the church. So I'll just make a quick plug, right? So we are about to finally wrap up our 2022 audit. This might be the second year that we're actually doing it on time. Yeah. Thank you to Mike for being on it. It's been great. So we're going to wrap up the audit, and we're starting to make it an annual tradition that we will actually present to the church. There'll be a meeting after church one Sunday. We'll invite everyone to come. We'll talk through the financials. People will get to know and understand like where all the tithing and the giving goes. Last year's meeting was pretty poorly attended. I announced it. I was really excited. Like Mike was really excited. We thought there's so many people coming to listen. And then I think 5 people showed up. So we will have it. We don't have a date yet because we're waiting for the audit to finish. But hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next week, maybe two, the audit will be completely finalized, submitted, and then we will have a meeting. I would encourage. Okay, everyone would probably be a little too optimistic, but many of you to come, right? Financials do not need to be boring and dry. I'm not saying that there will be interpretive dance along with our annual statements, but it's important. It is important. So please come. That's a quick teaser, if you will. The quick take on it, if you are curious, is that we are neither overflowing in surplus nor are we drowning in debt, right? So the church as a whole, we're kind of doing okay-ish, right? I think from Mike's perspective, he would like us to have more of a surplus, but God provides, right? The lights are on, there's air conditioning, right? We're not getting kicked out of the building. God provides, but I would also say that some of our fixed costs are going up, like our rent will go up this year. I think starting in November. Electricity is everything is rising. That's just inflation and how things work. But beyond the cost side of things rising, also the things that we want to do, right, are big, right? We have this big vision of being generous to our community, to our neighborhood, to the people around us. But we can only be generous. Inspire Church can only be generous if the people of Inspire are generous, because frankly speaking, at the end of the day, the church doesn't really make money. Like, we don't make widgets. We don't have, a platinum award winning creative ministry that sells records or streams and makes royalties off of that we can then give away. The church can only be generous if the people of the church, if we are generous. So, again, that was actually not the point of the message today. So I'll move on. If you remember nothing else, quick plug, finance meeting coming up sometime in the next couple months. Please come. We should probably do it after the summer, huh? Like once everyone is back. Yeah, okay. So maybe after the summer. So you all can go away and not be, not stay awake at night thinking that you might be missing the finance meeting. So go off for your summer holidays or whatever with the family, with the kids. Go take a break. And then once it's so weird to say summer in Singapore. There is no summer in Singapore. But after the summer is over, we will have the finance meeting. So living a life that sings worship means living a generous life, right? And it's generous in all dimensions, in all ways, whether it's your energy, your time, your emotion, your thoughts. Again, right, the message that you're sleeping, you're waking, you're eating. And I think we could talk about what that means for hours and hours and hours, days, months, years. Because I do think that, again, it's just tied to following Jesus. And I think if you talk about following Jesus, you have to talk about being generous. You really can't separate them. But I thought that, rather than keep you all here for hours and hours or days or weeks or years, I mean, honestly, that's what coming to church and being part of community is. Because we're all learning how to be generous together. We're all learning how to follow Jesus together. But I'll share a couple of thoughts that came to me, observations and things that, kind of came up and came to mind as I talked to some people about today's message, mostly my wife. And by the way, none of what I'm about to share is original. Like, truth is truth, and truth has been true since the beginning of creation, right? So none of what I'm going to share is original. You may have read or heard it in other places. Actually, I'll make a quick plug for a sermon by John Wesley called The Use of Money, which is, as with many things, available on the internet. It's amazing. It's kind of long. It is kind of written kind of weird because it was written in the 1800s. But there are a couple more modern translations of it where people have tried to basically take it from the KJV to the NIV. I don't think anyone's taken it to the Message yet, but trying to update the language of John Wesley's message. But it's actually a really good one. I'm not sure I agree with everything in it, because there is one part of it where he basically condemns basically almost every single distillery in England. And I'm not sure I'm ready to go there yet, but it was a product of its time, and alcoholism was a big thing. But anyway, so again, lots of tangents. Some simple truths. I think one thing about the first simple truth about generosity is that it is not self-destructive. So I think sometimes people who grow up in church or who spend time, in Christian circles will think, oh, yeah, I have to, it involves self-sacrifice, right? Like it has to be sacrificial giving. That's a term, right, that you hear in Christian teaching and Christian circles sometimes. But I think we need to be careful that we don't automatically equate sacrifice and sacrificial giving with hurting ourselves, because I don't think the two are the same, right? So it's not, giving and being generous is not self-destructive. The way that I think about it is twofold. Number one is very practical, which is that if you are starving yourself to feed other people, at some point you're going to be the one that's starving and in need of help, and then that kind of defeats the purpose. Plus, it also means that you probably will not be able to help other people at that point, just physically too weak to help other people. The second is that as I think about what the good news of Jesus is, right, the kind of life that Jesus calls us to have in effect, that means what we should be feeling. It is permeated by joy, right? I think some of the songs we sang earlier kind of just really just captured it so well, right? Like we don't have to earn this, right? It's the end of all striving, right? Like that is the hallmark of Christianity, of following Jesus, right? This is not some kind of we should not be this kind of miserable, no one is happy, everyone is deeply, deeply unhappy and feeling broken all the time faith, right? That is not the Christian faith. That is not an accurate depiction of what following Jesus is, right? I mean, Jesus said that he came that we may have life, have it more abundantly, right? Jesus was about celebrating life, right? Because of God's love for us. And so thinking and putting it in that context, when you're living a generous life, when you're living a life of worship, it shouldn't mean self-destruction. It shouldn't mean that you're like, oh, I worship God, and therefore I have to be poor, and I have to always be in want, and I have to constantly deny myself in everything, right? I don't think that's it at all. I think we need to take care of ourselves. I think that we're actually called to take care of ourselves, right? Making sure that we've got enough food to eat, a place to live, clothes to wear, that our basic needs are met. It also doesn't mean indulgence, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to eat at a Michelin Bib Gourmand or Michelin starred restaurant every day. It doesn't mean that your daily diet is Wagyu beef and caviar. Actually, that's probably a terrible diet for you. But it's not indulgence. It's not deprivation. I do think that there is, in between those two extremes, a great call to live as simply as we can, right? Again, going back to this concept that we should learn to be content in all our circumstances. But if you can learn to be content with less, right? Really content, not just I really wish I had 3 meals a day, but it's okay. I'm learning to be content with less, so I'll just eat 2 meals a day, right? It's not what I'm talking about, but genuinely content, being able to say, I don't need all of this luxury. I don't need as much as I have, right? I think we'll actually end up being more joyful, frankly speaking, right? And beyond just being more joyful, it will also, living a life of simplicity will also give us more to give away, right? Give us more that we can be generous with others with. So that's the first. Generosity does not mean self-destruction. It doesn't mean hurting yourself in order to be generous and to give to others. The second thing is that it doesn't take away from our families and our loved ones. So, believe it or not, there are lines of religious teaching that say you should give to your religious faith, your church, your temple, whatever, and you should give even if it means that you can't support your family as much as you would want to, right? And it's not just a modern day thing. Even again back in Jesus' time, this was a thing, right? So there's a passage in Mark where Jesus again. John really was like Jesus. Like they just kind of called it as it is. Actually, they just were just very blunt and very honest with people. But where Jesus says, right? We could just read it, right? You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions, right? For Moses said, "Honor your father and mother. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death." But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, it's a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. So the idea there was that in the Jewish faith of the time, people would give gifts, right? They would bring offerings to the temple or the synagogue as a gift to God, and then it would be taken in by the religious leaders and priests, and then used for whatever the uses were. But what Jesus was talking about here was where some people were saying, "Oh, well, this is meant to be a gift for the temple. This is meant to be a gift for the synagogue, and so I can't use it to support my mother and father, right?" And as we just read, Jesus was pretty against that, right? Jesus was pretty against that. And it's a teaching that carried on in the early church as well, right? So in 1 Timothy, there was a similar admonishment, right? That, anyone who doesn't provide for their relatives, right, for their own household, has denied the faith, is worse than an unbeliever, right? So the idea here is that, yes, we're called to be generous, but generosity should not come at the expense of your family. We're called to care for our families, right? Your life partner, your spouse, your children, the guardian, the wards in your care, right? If you're a guardian to a child, right, or you just have a relationship of caring for a child, right? That has to come first. This one actually really spoke to me a lot because it spoke to where I am in life right now, actually, and some stuff that's been going on for me. So, I find it hard to say no. I find it hard not to help people. My mother once, when I was much younger, made this observation, critique of me and my sister, which is that we're always trying to save the world, that we always think we can do everything, and that we need to always be saving the world. To which we both looked at each other and said, "Yeah, I wonder where we get that from, right?" And then looked at her because she is like that as well. But in the last few weeks, months, in this current season of my life, for various reasons, I've just been trying to help different people with different things, right? Friends with their businesses. I do some for church. I've got work stuff going on, and so I am trying to be generous with my life, but I kind of realized that it was costing my family, right? So Holly, my wife, spoke to me on it and said, "Look, this is all good, but we need you too." And it was a hard thing to hear, because it's true, and because I knew that I had not been following that simple truth, right, of putting my family first. And it was humbling. It was really, really humbling. But it was good. I mean, again, this is one of the great things about having someone who can speak truth to your life. It reminded me that I need to keep this in mind, that my family has to come first, right? I have to take care of my household, my wife, my kids. That generosity cannot be at the expense of the people who are right there around us, the first people that we're called to love and care for. Third thing, and then we'll start wrapping up, is that it isn't a one-size-fits-all thing, right? In the Bible, there is this concept of the tithe, and we still use that word today, which literally means to give a tenth of everything you have. But sometimes people take it to extremes, right? Jesus criticized the religious leaders of his day because some of them really took it to extremes that you have to give a tenth of your spices, right? So imagine like taking a tenth of your salt at home and then bringing it to church. I have no idea what you do with it. Please don't bring your salt to church, right? But some people took it to that extreme where it was a tenth of everything, right? Had to be tithed. But living a generous life is going to look different for all of us because we are different people in different circumstances. One thing that is so true about the life that God calls us to live is that it is not rigid and it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of life. Some of us will give 10%, right? Some of us will give more than 10%. Some of us will give less, right? Some of us just, look, frankly speaking, there are people who in today's world, right, they because of the kinds of jobs that they have or because of the needs in their life, maybe there are medical issues or other issues, they just don't have that much income left and that much money left after they've taken care of basic things that they need or they and their family need to just go on living, right? Should they really be giving a tenth of zero? Well, you could give a tenth of zero, it's still zero. On the other hand, some of us have lots, right? Like, after we've paid for all the basics and if we live a simple life, we have even more. And then we have way more to give, right? Even after saving for the future and everything else, and that's all good. But maybe even after all of that, maybe we have more. Maybe we need to think about what we should do with that. There's a singer-songwriter who I adore. He's amazing. He's also dead, but his name is Rich Mullins. He was a U.S. Christian singer-songwriter in the heyday of what was called CCM, Contemporary Christian Music. Those of you in your 40s who had exposure to American evangelicalism may know what I'm talking about. But the rest of you are too young, so never mind. It's fine. So Rich Mullins was extremely successful. Like Amy Grant, okay, I'm really dating us. Amy Grant, who was another really super famous Christian singer, sang his songs. Basically anyone who's anyone in the largely American contemporary Christian music scene would say Rich Mullins was an influence, was amazing. He was a really fascinating guy. They wrote a book about him, An Arrow Pointing Straight to Heaven. Totally worth the read. Totally worth listening to Rich Mullins' music, by the way, even if it may sound slightly country. But he was immensely successful. He probably sold millions of records, made multiple millions of dollars, but he insisted that he would only get paid about $24,000 a year. And everything else, he just told his accountant just to give it away, give it to churches, charities, whatever. But he was just like, I just don't want it. He actually, I think at one point confessed, was scared of what would happen to him if he had all that much money. And so he just asked for just $24,000 and everything else was just given away. Radical. I'm not suggesting that we do that. Frankly speaking, it would be tough. I don't think I could do it, right? I'll just be honest. I'm not suggesting that, but what I am suggesting is that it isn't one size fits all. Each of us should figure out, how do we be generous? And by the way, it's not just about money, it's also about time, right? When you've just had a baby, you do not have time to serve in church all the time, or a lot, right? Or when you have young kids, right? Time is scarce then, maybe not the money, but the time. The idea is not that you have to give a certain percentage or a certain amount. The idea is just to give, right? And to keep thinking, well, how do I give and how do I give more? Again, in a way that doesn't destroy you, in a way that doesn't come at the expense of your family. But how do I give more? I'll close with what I think is a kind of interesting or a funny observation, which is this, right? The more generous you are, the richer you become. And I know that may sound counterintuitive, so I'll say it again, and then I'll explain it. The more generous you are, the richer you become. Because here's the thing, right? Being rich isn't actually about how much you have, right? It's not about how much money. It's not about material possessions. It's not about time, right? And honestly, with time, like, you can't possibly get more time than anyone else. Like, we all get 24 hours to deal with it. But the more generous you are, I think what happens is that our mindset, right, shifts. The way that we think, the way that we ascribe value to the things in life shifts. And in that shift, I think we become richer. Now, it might be that, like maybe some of us really do become richer the more that we give, like literally. And that's great, but I don't think that is always going to be true. But what I think is definitely always going to be true is that the more you give, the more you realize how much you have, how much that you've been given, how much that we've been given, right? And I think beyond that, there is also the simple truth that when you give, when you follow Jesus, you're guaranteed a richer life, a fuller life, right? It may not always feel like it, I'll be honest. Sometimes it feels hard. And sometimes, it feels like it's, you may sometimes feel somewhat alone, I think, right? Or at least bucking the trend, shall we say, going against the way of the world. But you will feel more alive, more joy. You will feel richer by living a more generous life. So that's kind of all I had. I know we're just at about time. So yeah, that's it. Live a generous life. Worship God. I'll close this out in prayer, and then let's go do it. Jesus, thank you for living the most generous life of all. Thank you for showing us through your words and just the things that you did, what generosity looked like. Thank you for calling us to live lives of worshipful, true generosity. And help us to try and do that each and every day, every breath, every moment, everything that we have, to just be more generous, that our lives may really sing worship, and not just with our mouths and our playing of instruments, but just with the way that our lives are, just the way that we live, our eating, our sleeping, our working, that all of it will be worship, God. So thank you. Thank you for this incredible community. Thank you for the people gathered here. So blessed to have wonderful, wonderful community around us. So we thank you, and we just ask that you continue to be with us and help us be aware of you in every moment. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. That's it.